if you can bear with me a little bit longer, we're waiting for a few more people to join. And we will kick off very shortly for this interesting discussion tonight on the future of journalism, effectively. So we'll just wait a few more minutes and see if there's some more people wanting to join. We also have one of our presenters has been held up in traffic, so waiting for her to join. She'll join us as the event goes on. Welcome, Anna. Okay, it's just after 5 o'clock, and I think we should kick off.
Hi all.
Other people will join in as they come online, but we'll start off at 5 o'clock because we have a lot to cover tonight, I'm sure. So welcome to the When Queensland webinar. Can Australian media survive without advertising? The future of the news. I'm Christine Williams. I'm the chair of the Women Economics Network in Queensland, and I would like to welcome you to the webinar. It seems somewhat appropriate that we're having this discussion on the day The Guardian is celebrating its 200th anniversary. 200 years since the 4-page weekly first appeared in Manchester, and some 54,000 editions later, and The Guardian has evolved very significantly over that time to be digitally available across the world to tens of millions of readers. How we consume news has changed dramatically over recent decades. I'm old enough to remember the twice daily delivery of a newspaper to our house in Scotland. And now it was delivered twice a day, then it went down probably to once a day as the evening papers dropped out. And now we've gone the other way, that we have news instantly delivered. I think, if you've got a smartwatch, you're constantly getting little beeps and updates of news coming in. So when we have news being delivered instantly via news channels as well as social media, how are we actually going to go ahead and support that in a sustainable way? Who's paying for this news is now a key question as advertisers move to alternative channels to find customers. So can Australian media survive? Tonight we have two very well qualified women to discuss this topic. Professor Amanda Lotz is Professor and leader of the Transforming Media Industry Research Project in the Digital Media Research Centre at the Queensland University of Technology. She's also a co-author or editor of 10 books to explore television and media, and as an active contributor to and user of many of the new news media channels, podcasts, Twitter, as well as contributing articles to more traditional media such as the LA Times, The Guardian, and even Men's Health. Welcome, Amanda. We also have joining us tonight Anna Draffin, the CEO of Public Interest Journalism Initiative, an independent think tank representing the researching the future for public interest journalism. This group has really actively participated and contributed to the debate surrounding the news media and digital platforms mandatory bargaining code introduced into the House of Representatives in December 10, 2020. So Anna's therefore very well qualified to discuss what this means for public journalism in Australia and whether it can offer a real solution. Welcome, Anna. So just setting things right, tonight's discussion will take the form of a brief presentation by each of the presenters, followed by just general discussion and questions. And I'd encourage you to use the question button at the feature of Zoom to pose questions to either Amanda or Anna or both. Our presentation will be recorded and will be available later, hopefully on our WEN YouTube channel. So let's let the debate begin. Amanda, over to you first.
Thank you. Just going to go ahead and share some slides that are going to provide some background detail for what I have to say. And Research over the last 2 decades has examined the implications of digital change on media industries. I'm just going to focus on the story of newspapers here. I'll offer tonight a sort of meso-economic look at what has happened to set the stage for appreciating a variety of issues that Anna will discuss and is more expert on in terms of their nuances. So not quite macro, not quite micro, but something in between. First, it's important to understand that the decline in newspapers is not a new or strictly digital phenomena. Newspapers have been around a long time, but their business models and what they produce have changed a lot. So in the history, we have things like the moment of the penny press. Papers were very cheap, also very sensationalistic. Also before that, a very partisan press where newspapers were very expensive and they circulated among a few, which was related to lower levels of literacy. So it's important to keep in mind that what we know as newspapers of the last century, for the most part, were arrived due to a particular set of norms that arrived from the technological and economic conditions of that time. There's nothing particularly natural about that form. Arguably, we are now in a new set of technological and economic conditions. This data shows that newspaper sales, holding population constant, have been declining in Australia since 1977, although really arguably since the 40s, which is also the case in the United States. The papers, as you can see here, declined much more between the years of 1977 and 1996, which is notably a pre-digital period. The common explanation for this story is the emergence of television and the way that television comes in and becomes a substitute. Television is the dominant reported source of news in Australia at 63%. The source of this data changes around 2011, so the data actually isn't perfect, but the general curve and the trend line is clear and correct. It slopes again strongly downward after 2000, especially after 2011. The newspaper business has 2 revenue streams. In Australia, 70% of revenue came from advertising. And this means that the primary business of newspapers was attracting and selling attention. Advertisers didn't care what readers read, just that they read the newspaper. Advertising in newspapers was valuable to advertisers because newspapers reached a mass audience, which they accomplished by offering a heterogeneous bundle of content. The value proposition of the newspaper to readers, again, which was strongly subsidized by advertisers, came from its ability to offer readers many things to attract their attention. So newspapers offered basic information, things like weather and sports scores that seem readily available now, but it's important to remember that a newspaper could be valued simply for having that kind of information in another era. Newspapers also had a lot of what's happening or general news of the day, a very thin layer of detail that is also made available by broadcasters and now found on websites and social media feeds. This thin layer of detail makes it possible to know what is going on, even without clicking through to stories you might find in a social media feed. Such news of the day is now so ubiquitous that the commodity value that it once added to papers, whether in print or online, has been eroded. Newspapers, of course, also offered and offer still today investigative accounts, and they break news and expose happenings that aren't readily apparent in the news of the day. And they offer many other things that added value or may have been the primary value to readers. Things like comics and recipes, opinions, obituaries, even advertisements. So at a starting point, it's crucial to understand that the foundation of the historical newspaper business model has been eroded by its unbundling. All of those things that I just mentioned, except journalism, are now available in other ways, often in ways that are a better experience for consumers. I don't have time to go into all of the details about what happened in each sector, but the short version is that the heterogeneity in features that the newspaper offered that enabled it to reach a mass audience is gone. And this substantially impacts the value proposition that it can provide. Newspapers remain a crucial source of journalism, but the scale of audience that finds an adequate value proposition is much smaller, and advertisers now have better advertising tools available. Better, given that their goal is selling things, not ensuring that people have access to journalism. The next Two slides are sobering. From the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, during the 2019 UK general election, tracked more than 1,700 people aged 18 to 65 across mobile and desktop devices for 6 weeks in order to find out how much time they spent online with news in a random sample. This is difficult research to do, but it also is illustrative of the marketplace. Of all the time people in the sample spent online, only 16 minutes per week was spent with news, which made the time spent with news a mere 3% of time spent online. Another Reuters study by Nielsen and Selva asked people how often they access and how interested they are in news. And they found only 17% could be categorized as news lovers, or more significantly, that the other 83% described themselves as, at most, somewhat interested and likely to access news once a day. I suspect that this kind of information explains the high level of people who rely on television for news, even though it mostly offers an inferior product from a journalism perspective. This view of the market is important, given that it is only the journalism that remains as the value proposition of newspapers. In terms of revenue, advertiser spending generally is moving to new tools. But importantly, this isn't about journalism, it's about advertising. The situation is depicted well in this data from the ACCC. The yellow bit is spent online, and we see tremendous growth. It has grown from 0 to 50% of advertiser spending in less than 20 years. Online is a lot of different things, and valuably, the ACCC breaks it out in the chart to the right. We see most of the spending goes to Google and Facebook. The most recent data out of the US earlier this year shows now Amazon accounting for 10%, Facebook 25%, and Google 29%. Most of that online spend has come at the expense of advertising that used to be spent on print media, that bluish purple bit below the yellow. This pattern isn't exclusive to Australia. The consequence is especially stark for countries that were heavily dependent on advertising to support media. So the situation is worse in the US, where newspapers received 80% of revenue from advertising and lack a properly funded public broadcaster has led to a really advanced journalism crisis. In Australia, newspapers were quite reliant on advertising, again, 70%. Here we can see the same information presented as share of Australian advertiser spending. And we see spending on print drops from roughly 60% to 12% of the Australian ad spend between the years of 2000 and 2017. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about how Google and Facebook account for such a large share of digital ad revenue, which is the case, but not nearly enough conversation about why. Now, clearly, it is not because they are better providers of news and journalism, because that is a marginal amount of people's use of those platforms. As the Reuters Institute research illustrates, most of the reason people are online isn't about news. And of course, those companies don't produce news. They're just recirculating that created by others. Google, Amazon, and social media are, in all of their offerings, better providers of attention. They have such a substantial share of ad spending because they offer advertisers a better value proposition than the advertising tools that advertisers are leaving. So in terms of search, both Google and Amazon offer advertisers the opportunity to place ads in front of people precisely when they are looking for a thing, and the advertisers only pay if the users click on them. Facebook and other social media offer more precise targeting than commercial television or newspapers, and it's also where we now spend most of our time grazing. We don't spend it flipping through pages of a newspaper. Decreasingly, we spend it seeing what's on TV, but more and more just in our feeds, and that's where the attention is. So to pull this together, I think the key takeaways here are that the newspaper crisis results from newspapers no longer being as effective a tool for attracting attention. As a result, if we're interested in solutions, we should probably not be focusing so much on newspapers as journalism and identifying the ways in which we might find alternative funding models for journalism. And that is a big story, a simplistic version of the story in a little under 15 minutes. Importantly, there's a lot more to be said about what kinds of journalism scale. If we look at the marketplace today, we see newspapers offering national and international news, pivoting to a greater reliance on subscriber fees and making a go. But there are far more players trying exactly that same strategy, and they overwhelmingly offer only national level news, national or international. Related, and in contrast, the situation of local news is quite different. It lacks scale, which has discouraged commercial providers, especially those who have viewed newspapers as investor-grade businesses. But interestingly, in that local space, there are also no substitutes. The internet has done little to service people's need for information, news, and journalism about their local community. So hopefully we can come around to that when we get to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Just having a technical issue there. Now over to Anna and some perspectives from the PG point of view. You are on mute.
Trying to share my screen at the same time. Bear with me, please. So following on from Amanda, and clearly she's taken us through the flight of the advertising dollar. And it's interesting, the ACCC's figures released on the advertising dollar share in Australia at the beginning of 2021 was that Google and Facebook combined amounted to 81 cents in the advertising dollar, which had increased almost 10 cents from the previous data release. So interesting just to see at a Australian domestic level how that shifted just within the last, I think it was 2 years of data since the previous capture by the ACCC. So just to introduce you to some of PG's work. So as Christine said, we're a specialised think tank that is focused entirely on sustainability of public interest journalism. We're an evidence-based organisation that puts out research that is filling the critical data gaps to make sure that we're having an informed public debate and discussion around the public good, that is public interest journalism, but also importantly to inform the policymakers around the interventions that they're contemplating. Now, there were some remedial responses particular to the news media industry last year as we saw collapsing media outlets around the country. And one of the tools that was used to track that is PG's Australian News Room Mapping Project that we launched. We raced forward as we saw COVID advancing to Australia's shore, and we launched this on the 1st of April last year. It holds 2 years worth of data commencing from the 1st of January 2019, and it tracks changes to news production. So this is not baseline news production across Australia. This is just showing you the traffic light analysis of contractions that we particularly saw accelerate through last year as COVID really decimated what remained of the advertising dollar. So just to give some colour in around that, the remaining advertising dollar that still remained fairly strong with news providers was the aviation industry, tourism, entertainment and hospitality. And we all know that they were some of the hardest hit industries through the COVID years. So that advertising market, the bottom dropped out of it, the news media, as rapidly as those industries were contracting through COVID. So as a consequence, through the first 2 months of COVID, we saw on average news closures, either temporary or permanent, every day for the first 2 months of COVID across Australian news providers. And this is data as of the end of last year, 31 December 2020. At that stage, we had seen 67% of contractions concentrated in regional areas, strong clusters in Queensland and regional New South Wales. And then just over a third of the contractions were in outer metropolitan areas. So we know that the outer suburbs, particularly news publishers, have seen many closures that have now become permanent. On a slightly lighter note, we did see communities respond, particularly in the rural and regional areas, with some startups, which accounts for some of the green dots that you can see. It is important to remember, though, that this data doesn't show you the proportionality. So where you might have seen a newsroom close with, say, 10 journalists and editorial staff in it, that shows the same size as you would for a startup that has one journalist and editor role combined within a community. Nonetheless, it is encouraging to see some green shoots appearing. But the net contraction across last year was absolutely devastating. We are still seeing some further changes as the market tries to recalibrate to what is the new post-COVID norm. And so for those that are interested, we release new data at the beginning of every month with an analytical report on those changes and the cumulative response. So please jump on our website, which is just pidgey.com.au, and you can certainly get updates there. So Pidgey does research in 3 key areas. So mapping of media diversity, which is what the news media map showed. Equally, we look at value, public value and support for public interest journalism. And then the third area we look at is investment and financial sustainability into public interest journalism. I think one of the key points of understanding is the amount of upheaval that the industry is going through. And this gives you a sense of the work that Pidgey is focusing on in terms of policy levers at the minute. We've had the mandatory news media bargaining code. We're now in the implementation phase of that code, but that code is scheduled for review in February next year after the first 12 months. We've got the Australian Code of Practice on Disinformation and Misinformation, which is a key concern. We've got a Senate inquiry into press freedom that's ongoing. We've got another inquiry into media diversity. We've got a green paper that was released just before Christmas on media reform. We've obviously got a new federal election pending somewhere within the next 12 months or less than now. We've got budgets coming through next week. And then there's also another Senate inquiry or select inquiry into foreign interference through social media. These are just some of the key policy areas that Pidgey is working on. There's plenty of other parliamentary inquiries that we are choosing not to participate in. But I think it's really important just to understand why news media businesses are struggling on a day-to-day front in amongst how they economically survive and reset their business model. So we all know that the business model was broken pre-COVID. The economic downturn has just accelerated that. And now what this is demonstrating is that we're not actually in a state of regulatory fit for purpose. Instead, what we have is highly fragmented regulation across the industry that still relies in many areas along 20th century concepts of TV, radio, publishers, and then online as something else. Whereas we're now in an era of media convergence, and I'm sure most of you are fairly agnostic as to how you consume your media. I think about my daughter the other day wanting to know what something was sitting on our front lawn. Someone had accidentally thrown a newspaper onto our front lawn, and she couldn't recall seeing one of those since she was a toddler. So I think one of the key considerations we have is this fragmented regulatory environment in which news media is operating and being asked to respond whilst dealing with fairly complex transitions on their day-to-day business model. The other thing that we've seen of the last 12 months is the increased consumer demand and recognition of the role of news media within our society. So this talks to that underlying public good. So one of the key findings out of the Bushfire Royal Commission was the recognition that news media is part of emergency infrastructure. and needs to be viewed and supported as such. The pandemic has only amplified that need for hyperlocal news and how important when crises hit that you have that access to hyperlocal news, which a national newscaster is never going to be able to provide. And then, of course, the third one, which we've seen particularly alarmingly demonstrated through the American federal election, is the significant rise of disinformation and misinformation. And that's obviously a chief concern within the Australian Parliament at the moment as we head towards another federal election, and the ways in which misinformation in particular can be combated, because that is where professional journalism that comes from a curated source that is accountable to independent editorial standards, but also most importantly is also accountable to an external complaints process, so that they are actually held to public account, kicks in, because news media is critical to the offset of misinformation. So that just gives you a flavour around where some of the complexity lies, and also just how busy the industry is in these times of disruption. So from Pidgey's perspective, we see that there's 4 key areas that contribute into a sustainable ecosystem for news media. So the media industry itself, and it's important that that all businesses reinvest in themselves, and particularly into quality journalism. Philanthropy, which we've seen, is a rising model that's been reasonably successful, particularly out of the US, in terms of supporting the rise of hyperlocal journalism, startups in particular regions, etc. That being said, it should be recognised that the philanthropic market in Australia is much, much smaller, and its appetite to fund news media ad infinitum remains to be tested. And Pidgey is actually undertaking some research in amongst the philanthropic market at the minute, which we'll be releasing in a few months, around those questions of propensity and capacity. Third area, of course, is government. What we saw amply demonstrated last year is ways in which government can fund and help support the underlying public good of news media without actually interfering in any content. So in the past, there's always been debates around separation, the fourth estate from government, etc. I think it's a fairly well demonstrated now that there are ways in which government can provide support with actually not creating questions around conflicts of interest, etc. And then, of course, fourthly, the digital platforms, of which the News Media Bargaining Code was a key example of ways in which they contribute to the industry and are really important participants. They are now the major distribution model for news media, and we have benefited in many ways just through the audience reach that news media now has, but it has created a bottleneck in terms of the supply chain and how reliant the industry is on the digital platforms as gatekeepers to those audiences. So what does success look like from Pidgey's perspective? So we are interested in the preconditions that we've seen that need to be reset in the market. So for us, we've set ourselves a goal of 300 million per annum in direct or indirect support for the industry. I should say that is those interventions that are specifically related to public interest journalism outcomes. So we'll come to it, I'm sure, in the questions. The News Media Bargaining Code doesn't carry that obligation. Some news media players, such as the ABC and the Guardian, have come out and openly stated that they will invest all remuneration they achieve under those commercial agreements back investing in journalism, but there is no compulsion under that piece of legislation. And then the second goalpost we have is with regard to media plurality and diversity. So the 3 key indicators that we're interested in tracking is representation of voice, media ownership, and most importantly, community coverage. So our map goes to some way of showing some of those areas of concern, but we'll be undertaking more work more detailed mapping, which will be able to hold all the different players to account, and for us actually to see where the gaps in the Australian market lie, to make sure that we are actually delivering this public good to all Australian citizens so that they can function effectively in their decision making as part of our democracy. So I might leave it there, Christine. I don't think people need to know too much in and around Pidgey. Happy to take questions around some of the other work we do, but keen to get into the discussion.
Very good. Well, I'd encourage people to take this time to ask some questions. And if you would like to, let's stop sharing the screen. Excellent. I don't know why my computer keeps flipping off and disappearing every time anyone does anything else. Okay, I would like to kick off by just trying to understand a bit more about what the News Media Bargaining Code is actually meaning for participants and how it is being implemented, if there have been any signs of implementation so far.
I'll start perhaps. So far, Pidgey sits in a fairly unique position as an independent, non-partisan body in that all the news media organisations and the digital platforms engage with us on a regular basis. So we are tracking how negotiations are moving. From what we know of, there's estimated 155 million investment from Google through commercial arrangements with a variety of news media organisations so far. That's 155 million per annum. Some of those agreements range from 2 up to 5 years now. I understand that a couple of agreements have looking to increase in their longevity. So that is a fantastic start in terms of new money, new revenue streams coming in under what are straight commercial agreements. So I think one of the key things to understand is the News Media Bargaining Code was looking to address the market power imbalance as identified by the ACCC, and to just redress that market power imbalance in order to enable more commercial deals around content. It's not around a digital tax or anything to that extent, which is a common misconception. What has taken place at the moment is one of the last amendments on the News Media Bargaining Code was that the Treasurer retains the right of discretion around designating a digital platform under the code. And so at the moment, there is no digital platform designated because they have an opportunity to show a significant investment in the Australian news media market. And if the minister is satisfied, then he can elect not to designate a platform under the terms of the legislation. So one of the unintended consequences of that amendment means that some of the safeguards that were built into the legislation, particularly with the small to medium players in mind, so there are a couple of functions such as the right to collective bargaining by news media organisations, or the option for the digital platforms to issue what's known as a standard offer. So actually just put out an option that news media organisations could then opt into and just take it as a flat remuneration on content arrangements. Both of those options are not available because there is no designation under the legislation at the moment. So that is leading to some complexity, particularly for the small to medium players.
And do you think that might be something that gets resolved in the review and next year?
That's a really good question, Christine. Look, I think that's something at the moment, it was very, as I said, I think it was an unintended consequence in amongst the rush of the legislation passing and some last minute deals, particularly at the time the Australian government was very much focused on making sure that Facebook remained active in Australia. and I understand that was one chief consideration in order to keep all the parties active in the market here. How we redress that into the future is going to be tricky, because at the minute, all businesses are just entering into commercial and confidence arrangements. So it can't be legislated.
And the 155 million that has been contributed, is that part of your 300 million target that you're looking for, or is that separate?
So I'd count the Guardian's proportion of that, yes, because they've made a public commitment to it. At the moment, the ABC is still in negotiation, so that doesn't include a contribution or commercial deal, at least with the ABC. Obviously, that's something we'll be monitoring and looking to hold all participating bodies in account. Google has also been really supportive of encouraging news organisations to reinvest back into public interest journalism. But I think, pragmatically speaking, it's important to understand that in order for public interest journalism to exist and thrive, you actually need a thriving news media market in and around that.
Amanda, is there any comment you want to make on that?
No, I think Anna is far more across this particular issue than I am.
Well, we do have a question from the audience, and it says, I'm concerned about the dumbing down of public knowledge in Australia. Has a guaranteed public fund been canvassed to make sure that public news media has sufficient staff and other resources to ensure adequate fact-checking and avoidance generally of fake news? The ABC has had its budget continually eroded by government over the last decade. So who would like to take on that one first? Amanda?
Those strike me as all true statements. And I think one of the big challenges at the moment is to call it straight, the greater support of the national broadcasters is a particularly effective and efficient way to approach many of the problems facing not just news, but media more broadly when it comes to the creation of Australian content. The current government seems very unwilling and disinterested in expanding that support. So I think these continue to be, sort of cultural issues that probably don't need to be cultural issues. I think they're actually very good solutions in terms of the public media system. I think one way we might think about the issue of media diversity in a somewhat different way. Historically, we've thought about, how many outlets do you have? And I think in the emerging environment, another way to think about it is of news diversity in terms of how many different funding sources are available in the market, because it is simply, without the amount of money that advertisers once put into the system, there just can't be the number of providers that there once were. And so to the degree that things that are advertiser funded are about attracting attention, and you get different news when your goal is attracting attention than the news that you get when your goal is attracting subscribers and people who value and are feeling that they're getting something that's worth paying for. You get a different kind of news product. And then a national broadcaster with a public service remit is going to give you probably something a little bit different. So I think one of the key things to keep an eye on is trying to maintain diversity in funding sources. And that also helps address some of the concerns that come with as a more heavy reliance on subscription, which means less availability of news product than was the case when things were advertiser funded and more perceived as free.
Anna, any comment?
Yeah, look, in agreement with Amanda, I mean, business modelling 101 would always say spread your risk and diversify your revenue in order to do so. And what we've seen has been a disproportionate reliance on advertising revenue for too long. And despite digital disruption in other industries, I think it's fair to say the news media market was quite slow to react. That being said, We are certainly keen around a multiple of different fiscal measures to enable different revenue streams. Equally, because not every intervention isn't going to be a silver bullet for each business model. So for instance, the News Media Bargaining Code is creating fantastic outcomes for those large news media organisations that are already existing. It's not going to help wholesalers such as the National Newswire, AAP, or the News Corp One, and it's not available for startups until they get going in a proven model. So therefore, you do need other fiscal incentives for those other business models. So PG's done quite a lot of work around an industry rebate scheme. It's similar to the research and development scheme that's been operating for some time in Australia. The Canadians have actually just introduced that 12 months ago, and we're just waiting for their first round of data. But our modelling has shown that at a low level on a 25% rebate, that could return over 350 million per annum into the industry, and that is tied specifically to public interest journalism outcomes. So that's something that we are really encouraging government to consider. With regard to the notion of a public fund, we're also doing research in that area, which we'll be releasing later this year. We're looking at where public funds sit in other areas of social purpose or public good. So in rural and regional, in the sports industry, in the cultural industries, there are public funds that exist specifically around servicing the public purpose. And we're also talking to international colleagues who are looking at similar models. The closest model we've found to what we are investigating so far and have in mind is actually out of New Jersey, which has come about as the result of auctioning off some of the spectrum and the proceeds going into a fund. And the Australian government has floated that under their media reform green paper as one particular option of funding into a fund. We're exploring a fund that could have diversified revenue streams so that you could have consistent contributions coming from one of those quadrants that I showed earlier, and then you might have one-off such as you would get under auctioning off of broadcasting spectrum. But of course, you'd expect a rather large lump sum would come as a result.
Do you ever see a future where there may be basically people relying entirely on social media for their information? I'm old enough to think that I actually still look at the newspaper in the morning and online rather than the paper. The paper just fills up my recycling. But looking at the newspapers is a thing that I've been told is not a thing people do these days. They just pick it up from the feeds and the social media. So obviously last year with COVID, there was a fairly big structural change in terms of how people consume their news. Do you see anything that would have that trend continue to the point where the conventional newspaper is no longer?
I think a key question there is what do you mean when you say get your news from social media? The Pew Center out of the US does this survey, and I think the last number was something like 60% of people get their news from social media. And my question when I hear that statistic is always, well, yes, but what are they reading? Right? So there aren't a lot of entities that are social media specific that are actually creating news. For the most part, the social media functions as a distributor. So I could be reading a story from the ABC, the New York Times, the Guardian, and in every case, it might have been in my Twitter feed. So I think it is certainly the case that the nature of distribution is changing. And I think that's what has been so difficult in this transition. In other media industries, I think it's important to recognize how substantial the change in the distribution intermediaries have been and how changed the user experiences relative to journalism. If you think about the music industry and the way in which people access music now mostly through streaming services. It's where most of the money is coming from. When was the last time anyone bought an album? Now that was a massive transition for the industry, and it was not at all a transition that industry wanted to experience. But they recognized that this technology allowed people to engage with music in a way different from what they had been able to in the past, and that people really liked it, and that's what they wanted. And I think when I look across media industries, which is what my last project did, you know, I continue to see that kind of as a way of understanding why this space continues to struggle, because you do have people who are news lovers, but maybe the notion of having relationships just with different publishers is not how, it doesn't speak to the way they consume anymore. And that we haven't really come up with an aggregator that effectively transmits money for those people who do want to read omnivorously. So will newspapers continue? Perhaps in some cases. I think there are situations in which they continue to be the best way of delivering certain kinds of content. But I think the notion of, I think we need to think about organizations as the entities that create the news and how they survive. And perhaps worry less about whether they're pushing that information out digitally or on paper, or as the case is right now, for the most part, both.
Anna, would you like to make a comment there?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the trend across contractions in news last year was a flight to digital replacement. And what we're seeing is a lot of those, the print editions, so you're talking about publishers here, most of those are not returning to print editions. Some have resumed, and there are, at a hyper-local level, some new ones that are starting up with print editions. But one would still expect that the digital trend will still continue on a strong upward trajectory. Particularly as Amanda's touched on, as news aggregators become more and more commonplace. So, you know, some of you may use Apple News. Google's obviously has launched a new showcase here in Australia as a result of the News Media Bargaining Code. You'll start to see more of those curated news products coming through the digital platforms. The question that sits behind that, as the case with Apple News, is what is the fee share? And look, we're seeing Apple's having that problem in amongst the gaming industry at the minute that's being contested in the courts in the US. So you would expect to see the market forces continue to debate just within the supply chain how the dollars get divvied up amongst the different contributors.
And do you think the channel will affect what news looks like? I mean, news used to be a half a page story if it was a big story, but now it comes in little bites. So do you see that, will it be little short, sharp bites of information, or we're still going to get more detailed information, or will it be something that television would do? I'm just interested there.
Well, I mean, the beauty of digitalisation is that all those options are available, long form as well as short form. Of course, there's always the issue around clickbait and the algorithms that are driving that. And I think as the news industry, together with the digital platforms, become more thoughtful around how they're going to deliver news that is a public good, and start to be held more accountable around that delivery, we'll start to see more people actually involved in developing their algorithms. And certainly Google and Facebook, from my discussions with them, are looking at inside Australia, are actually introducing that people curation of news rather than just leaving it to AI, which is encouraging. And yeah, look, I think it's an evolving space, and it's really, I think, getting past this contest of the digital platforms versus the news media. Instead, this is the new format of the industry, and these are the key players, and how we move together meaningfully is really the next point of debate and discussion.
Amanda?
I think that one of the advantages of digital is just the flexibility, and we might not think about podcasts as journalism, but they are. And we may not think about some of the video forms that are emerging, but actually a lot of it is public interest journalism and storytelling in different forms. And there are long reads, longer reads than you could have fit in a newspaper, that are also part of the environment now. And so I think, again, the issue comes back to figuring out ways of distribution that help people find the things that they're interested in, and sorting out ways to make the creation of all of those different forms sustainable, because they are all a bit different. The podcasts are a really interesting space in terms of it's a space that advertisers have been very much running into, partly because podcasts can be so targeted, and that you have a very specific kind of listener, and because you can do ads in a way that aren't as annoying and can do a different kind of advertising than you can, let's say, just in a display ad. So it really is that the environment is just becoming much more multifaceted, and indeed probably all of it won't work. But I think one place to just sort of get a sense of really how rich the environment is spending some time just on the ABC websites and recognizing how much is there in terms of podcast, older content. News and journalism is so much more accessible than it has been in the past, when you had to listen at a certain time or watch at a certain time or miss it entirely. So these are all advantages of a digital environment that we need to consider as well.
So I've got a question here that, as a professional economist for over 30 years, I depend on quality news information. And once it was easy to know the quality of sources, but it's increasingly becoming difficult to identify the quality providers. Do you think a model that may prevail will be based on a peer review style news, such as The Conversation?
So certainly what we would expect to see as a rising phenomenon is fact checkers. So independent fact checkers, and certainly the misinformation, disinformation code is pointing quite strongly around the need for that ecosystem of fact checkers. And obviously the other big part of that is around external complaints authorities that have real power in terms of addressing breaches and holding news media to account. This is where we get into the contested space around the digital platforms being a delivery platform but not considered a publisher, and therefore not falling under that regulatory regime. So it's going to be an evolving space. There is, of course, also just the issue of public digital literacy, and actually making sure that it is a skill set that is part of our critical thinking and development. I know there's been some discussion in Victoria of recent weeks about looking to embed it inside the school curriculum from a very early age. We're all wise to the potential negative effects of social media outside of the news space on young people. And I think it's how we teach them around critical examination of what is credible news sources is going to be increasingly of importance.
Amanda?
No, I agree entirely. No, I think these are crucial skill sets, and knowing how to evaluate, knowing what to do when you're not sure, knowing how to find information in the contemporary environment, and all of it. It's not a simple checklist, right? Because the technologies and the sources, all of that is just going to continue to change constantly. And so it really is a way of thinking and being in the world that is just part of 21st century life.
And I think that leads to another question about how you actually do engage that in generation Y and Z, and I don't know what happens after that. They're just not being trained in news exposure. I mean, I remember as a kid, the newspapers were there and I didn't really pay much attention to them, but we'd be sitting down at dinner time and there'd be some discussion. Well, we don't have newspapers. People aren't necessarily sitting down at dinner time to talk about things. People don't sit around the same television set. The people have got their own screen that they're watching. So how do you actually then go about engaging people? I mean, having it part of the school curriculum is one option. Is that the only option, or how do you make people interested in the news? Make them more. I mean, we're talking about voting ages coming down, but if these people aren't actually able to take in information and news effectively, then that's a bit of a worry for democracy.
Which comes down to what Amanda was touching on earlier. It's around the delivery into those markets. So yes, there will be news delivered on TikTok, and I predict that in 2 years' time, we'll be talking about TikTok in amongst Google and Facebook, because that is where, you know, the sub-16 demographic sits.
And I think, you know, in the same way that a past generation, you know, grew up perhaps watching parents reading newspapers, you know, my children see my husband and I reading news online. My children are online a lot. I'm trying to make sure I know what they're doing, but I've also taken, you know, I send them stories from the ABC that are relevant to their interest. And we still do talk about, I read this morning. And so I think the idea of being engaged with news, it isn't tied strictly to the newspaper. You know, we're listening to public broadcasters in the car. We're talking about the world around us. So I think there's just new kinds of practices that are emerging, and it is overwhelming, right? And so it's following that question of what have you been doing watching YouTube? Well, what are you watching? Because sometimes I can say that often I am surprised to learn, well, it was a documentary about sharks. Okay, you know, not what I was expecting. So, you know, all of these forms of delivery, you know, they deliver all kinds of things, good and bad. And so again, it is a whole set of new literacy skills for parents as well.
Some parents are probably much more engaged in the exercise, such as yourself, than a lot of other parents who are quite happy to see the kids just keeping occupied doing anything. So, as it has always been. That's true. That's true.
But Facebook and Google both did us great favours through their objections in around the negotiations on the News Media Bargaining Code by undertaking public campaigns, because they reached those younger audiences and engaged them in that debate and discussion around whether it was a good thing or a bad thing in ways that the traditional news media never could have. So the Facebook blackout really got people's attention, and Google did a 4-6 week campaign around what their perspectives were, which equally I had, you know, my guys are mainly on YouTube, and they were coming to me saying, what's this block on the screen, Mum?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's one way of getting attention, is take away one thing that they're very, very reliant on. Another question here. In other industries, we've seen the alternative model of open source develop as an alternative to the mainstream providers or dominate groups such as Murdoch Press. Could public access media go open source, perhaps?
It is always a possibility. I think it is easier now than ever for public media to broadcast itself using, though, these same platforms we've been discussing. I mean, I think the issue keeps coming back, though, to, you know, the sustainability of those kind of models. At one point, there was a whole lot of optimism about the notion of citizen journalism, but in reality, citizens have jobs and lives, and actually journalism isn't a hobby. It's something that requires a professional devotion. And so these alternatives still need resourcing to make them viable. And I'm not convinced that, you know, sort of the difference of distributing online versus you know, some of the other distribution technologies actually makes a radical difference. But there are tools that are there. And actually, I should say, you know, some of the interesting experiments, I'm not sure what level things have to rise to make it onto the map, Anna. But in some cases, in reading about the state of local news in Australia, and you know, I think in some cases, it's communities that are so desperate to know what's going on that they're starting Facebook pages. And in many ways, I think that's, you know, that's a very sad situation, right? And it shows sort of the hypocrisy of the situation that you know, that's where communities have been left to turn. But in other cases, they are exactly, just sort of, they start out as one-man bands, and they find their interest, and they build a community from there. And I think one of the opportunities that I think perhaps is being missed by a lot of the focus, let's say, on the big things like the bargaining code and trying to prop up papers that have a failing business model, is trying to come up with different kinds of solutions, especially solutions that might solve the issues of scale for smaller community papers or community. Sometimes I think putting the word paper on it might make us think too small, but members of communities want to know what's going on. Most of them don't know what's going on. And we have now the kind of tools that should make it much easier if we look at those questions of community knowledge and try to maybe apply some more out-of-the-box solutions.
Anna?
So I think the other thing to remember, so citizen journalism is fantastic. And look, we've seen that with Arab Spring, the role of social media has been able to play has been extraordinary. But we also must remember that, as Amanda touched on, that professional practice that journalisms bring, and they're accountable under defamation laws, which can be incredibly costly. And we've got a couple of cases that appear in front of the court at the moment precisely on that. So it is important to remember that journalists at the end of the day are held to public account. And equally, the professional skills that they now are asked to bring is substantially different to where it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, you could be a newspaper columnist, you might post a couple of columns a week and maybe do a feature piece. You now may be asked to do 3 live postings in a day, a couple of radio interviews, and can you take your own photos and do your own editing? So it's a very complex set of skills that has now been asked of journalists, and they're also having to watch their audience responses and what their click metrics look like. So there's a complexity of business that I think people often, the general public often underestimate. It's very journalists easy fodder in terms of criticism, but we must also remember the great value that they bring. And it's through their hard work and tenacity that we have that information at our fingertips to make informed decisions. In terms of models, the BBC has a journalism placement program that's operating in the regions now as part of some of the BBC's dividend in terms of their own funding. And those journalists create content then is available to other news providers in that region. So there certainly are other models which have a co-sharing aspect, and we're starting to see a few models pop up in Australia which will be looking to those community engagement because it is going to be key in terms of sustainability, as Amanda touched on.
The issue of sustainability is fascinating, and it's probably an area we can sort of finish up with. As a long-term public sector employee, the whole 24/7 news cycle got very wearing. I mean, it's a very big difference between when I started work and when I finished in terms of the demands of keeping up with constant demands from journalists and others for information, ministers wanting information so they can feed the journalists, and sometimes the journalists coming direct. So the other side of that, as you just pointed out, Anna, you having these constant demands for journalists to upload stories, whether they're little short stories or longer ones. It's a constant pressure, and sustainability is about making sure that the model you have is something that can be maintained into the future. So what do you think about that aspect of it in terms of, do we have a sustainable model at the moment? Is obviously sustainability is something in terms of the economics of the whole economics of it, but also in can actually the journalism market actually continue to deliver when you have these constant demands of the digital demands of 24/7. Amanda.
No, I don't think where we are is sustained. I don't think we are yet on a path toward stasis, inventing new norms, et cetera. In some ways, I think it is very difficult out there. But in many ways, I don't know that sort of the perceived bottom has been hit yet. And I think honestly, part of that is a stronger need on the part of communities to demand more, and demand more help from their local governments, their federal governments, to help create access to basic information about the world around them, and the degree to which that is a requirement of functioning in a 21st century society. And we're seeing sort of bits of that, I think, right, in the recognition of how crucial something like broadband is in order to exist in this world. And to some degree, we've seen, I think, some of the departments more aggressively doing what needs to be done to help rural and regional areas in that regard. But this is not an evolution. This is radical adjustment. And I don't think we're quite there yet, or we're on the path toward building things that are designed for the current and future era. And so I think it's possible, but I'm not sure that we're still trying to solve the right problems that will get us onto that road. But
as someone lecturing in the journalism area, I can imagine that you'd be concerned about burnout among your young journalists, just having to keep up with the pace. So Anna, have you got a comment about the sustainability of the model?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously, economics 101, it's, disruption, both supply chain and demand. So I think, we're focused on the supply side of things tonight, but equally consumers haven't yet really expressed what their appetite is and propensity to pay. And look, we've seen this in other industries. The music industry's been through this, the publishing industry. Remember when we all thought books were going to go out of fashion, or the movies? No, people stopped going to theatre to watch movies. So it's working out the demand side of the equation and consumers really demonstrating their preparedness to pay. That being said, unlike those other parts of creative pursuit, we're also talking about a public good, which Amanda's touched on. And the pandemic and the bushfires demonstrated last year that when those crises hit, as we get to the point of news as emergency infrastructure, we as individuals have an expectation that news be available. And if not, that the government is to account as to why it's not there. So I think it's how we create that balance between a commercial, viable, thriving media industry, but also what are the interventions and supports that need to be in place for parts of the market that won't be commercially viable and never will be. But what are the criteria in which to assess those as to genuine need and make sure that we can provide a solution? And that's really some of the key issues that the industry is grappling with at the moment. So it's very important that you all stay mindful of your local news and actually go out and investigate. I mean, my local news has moved online, and because it doesn't get dropped in my postbox now, I never look at it online, which is appalling.
So are you generally quite optimistic about the future for journalism? Public interest journalism?
I think we have a really unique window for discussion and actually coming up with some solutions. I think if we fail to take action within the next 2 years, the opportunity will have passed and we'll just enter a stage of lethargy, and we will have market failure. And where there is market failure, we all know that in terms of infrastructure, it's incredibly expensive to rebuild, and there's always, that creates extremely high barriers to re-entry. So we need to be incredibly concerned about preserving what remains, supporting that while we transition to what a new future looks like, but also making sure that the regulatory framework is fit for purpose, but equally making sure that there are incentives for commercial models to thrive. Because if we rely on government purse only, we will end up with an unsustainable industry. And, you know, the commercial players are the majority of the market, and they do, for the most part, a really good job in terms of ensuring that we get daily news on that 24/7 news feed.
Amanda?
I'm less keen on the commercial options, but I think what this last year, it's sort of, as soon as you get your feet on the ground, it shifts and moves on you. But there have been a number of times where I have thought, you know, in terms of the field of research that I'm part of, that this should be such a rich and fertile time for, you know, unfortunately, very real world experiments, right? And, you know, in watching the situation in the United States, which I would characterize as a more advanced state of crisis, especially at the local level, right? So you do have entities like the New York Times that are doing quite well and have figured out how to pivot, but the New York Times isn't covering anything that's going on anywhere else, you know, other than at the national level. And the degree to which you can have people living in such phenomenally different realities and seeing the very material consequences of people not having good information, or there not being clear information, and to be frank about it, that people are dying as a result. You know, like that should have been a wake-up call, and it should be a wake-up call about how central these organizations actually are to the functioning of democracy, the functioning of economies. And so I hope that we don't forget how bad the very recent past and continuing to be the case, you know, have been, and how much worse these things would be with less information.
Well, certainly, obviously, an area where a lot is happening. And maybe we should touch base again in 12 to 18 months' time and see how things have evolved. Thank you so much.
Sorry, if I could just add one more thing, Christine, too,
Yep.
to Amanda's point. Yeah, we are also fairly unique in that we have two national public broadcasters, which are the two largest producers of public interest journalism content in the country. And that is not to be taken for granted. As we look to that American experience, they're incredibly envious of that structure we have. So, you know, it's about the ecosystem and how we make sure we really safeguard that underlying delivery of public interest journalism, regardless of the platforms. We need all the platforms to participate. So support your local news.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your contribution tonight. And I'm sure that everyone who's been online will be as fascinated as I've been to hear the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christine.